Hello, tank fans, and welcome to Totally Tanked, the podcast all about talking tanks. I'm Rob, and I'm here with...
Hello, my name is John, and it is the 24th of July, 2021. And we've had phenomenal growth in this podcast, Rob.
Episode 20 and on the way up.
Yeah, well, this is episode 20, but obviously we keep doing episodes, and that's great. But more people are listening to each episode, so welcome to all the new listeners. And also...
Welcome, Sweden.
Welcome, Sweden. Welcome back, the listeners who've been with us from the start, because you'll always be our favourites. And, and the southwest of England is our number one listener area in the UK, which is my family stomping ground. So
there you go. Thank you very much for listening in.
Yeah, I don't know what it is you're liking about us, but keep it up.
Today we're talking about a tank. Well, a light tank.
Is it a tank?
Is it a tank destroyer? The Jagdpanzer 38. Not a Hetzer. It's a Jagdpanzer 38. Sometimes it's called a 38T.
Are you sure it's not a Hetzer?
A little bit sure. Yes, anecdotal evidence says it is a Hetzer. So the name Hetzer is German for beta or chaser or a fast hunter. So to chase an animal down until it gets so tired that you can kill it easily, as the hunters do. I've
heard a few. I mean, it's funny because there's the whole. Did anyone ever call it a Hetzer? And let's get back to the naming maybe and describe the tank for our listeners first.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So it is a light tank destroyer built to kill things from ambush. It is not fast. It is not a relentless harrier of its prey in order to run them down so they're so tired that they can't get away any further and before they get killed. No, it is a ambush predator.
Yeah, it's a really interesting study of design expediency, and for once the Germans, instead of trying to build the biggest and the best, just went for good enough in a whole bunch of categories.
Having read about it, my takeaway was it was a bad design saved by a lot of other things going well. And I will go through that statement later.
Bad design, but a good concept.
Yes, we'll go through that as we go. But anyway, the Hetzer, as we discussed, is a light tank destroyer built by the Nazis from 44 to 45. They built 2,800 of them. They're all built by either the BMM or Skoda factories in Czechoslovakia or the Czech Republic.
It was Czechoslovakia then.
So it's Sudetenland, Czech Protectorate, whatever they were calling it.
Administrative region. Yeah.
Anyway, so it wasn't built in Germany. It was built in Czechoslovakia at the time. It was a light vehicle. It had a crew of 4 in a very funny shape. Sloped front armour of 60 mils at the front and 20 mils on the side, so very heavily sloped. Main thing was it had the Pak 39 anti-tank gun shoved inside of it, and that was the main thing. It had a proven 7.5 centimetre gun that would work. It was known to work and was known to be a very good anti-tank gun, and they just said, right, what can we do with this? We'll shove it inside the chassis, and it happened to be a chassis for the Czech tank, the 38T light tank.
Sometimes called the Panzer 38 because the Germans stole them in such huge numbers and used them very enthusiastically.
Well, it's one of the reasons why they wanted to take the Sudetenland prior to the war, was to get a lot of those Czech
tank factories
and tank divisions that had already been built.
Yep. Now, when we say the gun was hastily shoved into the design, it was shoved in so hastily that all the controls and the mechanisms for servicing the gun were jammed against the right-hand side of the gun, and the loader had to sort of lean on top of and around the gun to even load it. So this is a real fast kludge of a design. I think it was 4 months from when they first started thinking about it to entering production.
And that's what I wanted to say about saved by the good designers, that because they had all the parts ready, available, so the chassis of the 38T was already in use and in production by these Czech factories, and they said, right, we've got a chassis, we've got a gun, let's just put the two together.
They did modify the chassis a bit, like the road wheels are bigger, and I think it's a little wider, so it's not straight like the...
But the machinery to build it is already there.
Yeah. Because early in the war, the Germans did just grab pretty much any old vehicle on tracks, particularly the French ones, but also the Poles, and just shoved artillery on top of them in casemates in an ad hoc system of creating tank destroyers, which must have given their quartermasters absolute conniptions to have 15 different chassis with 15 different ammunition types, all sort of rumbling off in the same direction.
And hoping that they'd be able to shove something in that would go boom and kill
Yeah.
the enemy. I mean, front towards enemy.
Yeah, particularly when they all come from different countries, some of them with different lettering systems.
Yep. All right. Other notable things about the Hetzer was only weighed 16 tons, had a remote-fired MG-34 mounted on top, so you didn't have to stick your head out to fire the machine gun.
Which is quite odd because one of the notable things about the Hetzer is it has almost no visibility in any direction.
Yeah, so it's a real spray and pray type machine gun that you're throwing up there because you can't see anything. So we'll get to the visibility aspects of it.
I think there was a little tiny periscope that went with that machine gun.
Yeah, I still couldn't see to the right though.
Yeah,
so
right.
Things would get in the way of that periscope. The loader's periscope, seeing to the right. So the loader was the one who controlled the machine gun, the remote controlled machine gun.
Yeah, and also from what I've seen, I mean, and you can just tell by the dimensions of it, this is a very small box to fit a crew into. Was it 3 or 4?
It was four-person crew.
Yeah,
you had the
four-person.
driver, gunner, loader, all in a line, one behind the other.
The tank commander behind the gun.
And the tank commander behind the gun on the right-hand side. He was the only one on the right-hand side of the tank. All the others were on the left.
Yep.
The gun was situated on the right. I'm trying
to get to is that the machine gunner trying to maneuver the controls of this thing around in a 360-degree arc in a very small space is going to sort of be clambering over the top of everyone else in the tank as well while they're doing it.
Oh, I don't think there was any clambering. It was just a case of everybody pull your shoulders in and trying to get smacked in the head by the various handles. Because if you've seen any of the videos of looking inside the Hetzer, it is not big. It is very small.
Yep.
I would not have liked to have tried to squeeze myself in there.
Well, by this stage of the war, there weren't any fat Nazis, so that helps.
Yeah.
But no, I mean, very small amount of hatches, very small hatches. My main thing is that, particularly for the winter months, it'd be relatively warm having 4 bodies crammed into this space with an engine.
Yeah.
So there's that. It's got that going for it. It keeps the rain off and relatively warm. Not as good, of course, because the American tanks all had electrically heated crew suits that you'd just plug yourself into and control your temperature to whatever you like. So, moral of the story is be an American.
All right. So it had a 6-cylinder petrol engine and it was designed to do 40 k's on road. Yeah, we're not sure about that. With a 170 k range with its petrol tanks.
Mm-hmm. And what nation made the gearbox, Rob?
Yes, Brits.
It was a Praga Wilson British bus gearbox.
Yeah.
Made by the Skoda factory, I believe. So not actually British-made gearboxes, but it was pretty much the same gearboxes used in the Matilda tank.
There you go. I think the road wheels were also built based on British one of their designs. Something else was. Okay. Yeah, something else was.
I mean, the big tank ID, because when you're looking at these German self-propelled artillery, they're all kind of trapezoidal shaped and low with the gun just built into the chassis of the tank. But the way you tell your Hetzer from your, say, Stug is the 4 really big road wheels.
From the side. And you can also see the
Stug off on one side.
Stug is like almost twice as big.
Oh,
and
yeah.
has a great big flat engine bay on the back where you can sit all your troops if you want to carry them an infantry squad into battle. Whereas the Hetzer, there was none of that. You might pile 1 or 2 guys on the back slopes.
They'd be holding on for dear life.
Yeah, they're probably not happy about it.
But I mean, my point is really that viewed from, say, 400 meters, you would struggle to ID a Hetzer from a bunch of other, particularly the German cannon-carrying tank destroyers, just because if they were next to each other, you could tell them apart by size. But a Stug at 600 meters is going to look a lot like a Hetzer at 400.
Yes, that's if you saw them at all, which is the whole point of the Hetzer. Is it
low?
So its dimensions, because it was so small, it was only 2 meters high. It could hide very effectively, and that was part of the doctrine that was brought into being with it, because the Germans had found that other open-top tank destroyers while effective, had a higher profile, made them a much more visible target. And because they're open top, so the Martyrs and the Nashorns, they're much more susceptible to just artillery fire, and not direct hits, just the shrapnel going around from, and aircraft fire coming in with whatever size mill cannons shooting down at them. Could easily take out any troops in the open. Whereas by being closed-topped, the Hetzer had provided the protection from artillery fire and aircraft rounds, as well as being able to hide effectively because it's such a low-profile tanks, whereas the Martyrs and the Nashorns were quite high because their guns were built on top of the chassis rather than embedded in like the Hetzer.
Well, one of the things with the Hetzer that was quite innovative, again in the way that, a slightly dubious design to a good concept, and then some clever things in it, was they actually suspended the gun from the roof of the vehicle, which is actually increasingly popular in armoured vehicles because it makes them less vulnerable to mine damage. Just in the modern day, but it was something that the Hetzer did. I don't know if it did first, but it was reasonably noteworthy at the time. So instead of trying to build all the structures to support the gun up from the bottom of the tank, it was all hung from the top, which might have helped with traverse as well. But
well, it didn't have which traverse up and down.
Didn't traverse much.
No, it was supposed to have a left and right traverse of 30 degrees. However, because of the positioning of the gun inside the tank, you only had 5 degrees to the left and 11 degrees to the right, or the other way around, I can't remember. But basically, 16 degrees left and right total is not a lot of traverse. So once you got that first shot off, which was your important shot, you then had to move the tank if you wanted to get any other shots off, unless you were firing at a line of enemy tanks at a distance, whereby traversing 1 or 2 degrees left or right would get you a new target, which is realistically what the Hetzer wanted to be able to do.
Yeah, I mean, fundamentally with your Hetzer, the point is that you position it with a view down a road, and then you stick lots of tree branches over the top of it, and then you wait for the enemy advance units to come rumbling down the road, and then you shoot them, and it's got a big enough gun. Part of the clever compromises thing, the gun is big enough to destroy pretty much.
Yeah.
I mean, it'll take out a T-34 at 700 metres, which is a good sort of range. And laughably, it'll take out an IS-2 at 100 metres, and I'm like, I don't want that. Ask me to shoot a T-34.
That's from the front. Yeah, from the front.
Yeah, through the front armour of an IS-2. Yeah,
there was plenty of situations where they would circle around to the sides of the IS-2s and get them from the sides.
Yeah, but that's really getting past what a Hetzer's for doing flanking manoeuvres on that.
Yes.
But the point is, so you set up your ambush. The enemy rumbles down the road. You start. You shoot the front one. You shoot the back one. You then shoot the ones in the middle, and then you run away.
Yep.
Or more likely, you just shoot the lead one and run away. But
reset up, wait for them to come to you again, and then shoot the next lead one.
Now, I've got to say, underpowered engine, 20mm armour on the sides, it's really only good for keeping small arms fire off, and by all accounts, even Russian anti-tank rifles could penetrate the sides of these.
Yes.
Which is getting to be reasonably small.
Which is why the Russians were deploying them, was actually to take out the Stug 3's side armours, which was just as thick.
That's why they put those TIE fighter skirts on.
Yes.
Yeah.
And why even the Hetzer had smaller 5mm skirts built onto the sides of their tracks.
Yeah. But what strikes me is what would have been a better way to build your Hetzer. Instead of having to do a dodgy 3-point turn under enemy fire with your exposing your flanks the whole time, would have been to, a bit like the British Archer, to have the gun pointing backwards. So you just back into your firing position, and then you're ready to just scoot forwards away from the enemy.
Yeah, I think there was probably more to do with German doctrine of not building yourself to run away. You're building your tank to win the battle forwards, and there's a bit of morale and psychological thinking there, which was an important part of their doctrine and what they were trying to do. Was saying, we wanted tanks that could win the fight.
But for a tank that you're building in 44-45 as the Third Reich, not a lot of opportunities for that.
just remember it was designed from the beginning of 44, so D-Day hadn't happened yet, and so they didn't think they were totally stuffed at that point.
Yeah, but their best days were a long way behind
them. They were. Look, other things about it. So it came about. There was a couple of factors in the origins of the Hetzer. One was the Romanians had started building themselves a new tank called the Marsal, Maresal. I don't know how you would pronounce that correctly. Marsal, or whatever.
Yep.
But it was very similar look. It was much more triangular.
I think it's Maresal.
There you go.
Yeah.
Much more triangular, and with the gun mounted in the middle of the chassis. And a couple of German officers went along, had a look at it, and said, "Oh, I like that. That's a what do they call it?" And this is where the name Hetzer has actually come from. In their documents, they were saying, "Ein großer Hetzer, an impressive hunter." And that was one of the first, in April 44, that was one of the first documented uses of the name Hetzer for it, as what they were talking about, the Romanian version. And from that, the concept has come back and they said, look, if we need a light tank destroyer, this is not a bad idea. But what then happened was a bombing of the Stug 3 factory in Berlin has caused the great delays in the building of Stug 3s for the Nazis, and they've said, right, what are we going to do about this? We can't build as many Stug 3s. Let's start building some more tank destroyers somewhere else. Let's do it in Czechoslovakia and then go from there. But the one they already had the T-38. It was the T-38. 38T chassis in production. But the big thing is that the cranes built in the BMM and the Skoda factories were only rated to 16 tons, and so couldn't lift a Stug 3 out of production. Whereas the German cranes in their factories were rated to 24 tons, so it could build the Stugs.
Yep. Now I've heard a description saying that they thought the Skoda works actually could do more than 16, but they could definitely do less than 24. Now, for those who haven't been in a big industrial factory, the thing that makes a factory not a shed is pretty much the cranes that traverse the ceilings of these things. And this is really what we're talking about, is just what they're rated for and what they can do. I'm somewhat surprised that Skoda's cranes were so puny, because they've been a heavy engineering company.
Just remember, this BMM was the main factory that were doing all this. The Skoda only got involved later on when they needed extra capacity. Gotcha.
Okay. Certainly I've ridden Skoda train carriages that I believe predated the war. They were pretty ancient. Oddly enough, in Russia, they had a whole bunch of Skoda rolling stock. I'm not sure if they paid for it. But, look, let's talk a little bit more about the name, because lots of tank snobs, of which we can certainly be tank snobs from time to time.
Of course we are. But we're open to suggestions.
We'll say, it's the Jagdpanzer 38, or the Panzerjäger 38T. It is not the Hetzer. And
then the others will come back with Hetzer's going to Hetz, which I suppose is a meme that you get these days.
Yeah. I would also say, just on that one, though, that there is a letter from Guderian to Hitler in which he says the troops have taken to calling this thing a Hetzer. And that's some pretty solid primary documentation.
Not to mention, there are the lists of other names, the actual technical names for it. There was nothing standardized there. So when each battalion, company, division is calling these things something slightly different, whether it's Jagdpanzer 38 or 38T Panzer, whatever they're calling it. I saw a list of probably about 14 to 20 different designations in official documents from different battalions of what they were calling it, and that's why not surprising that they just came up with the name Hetzer. So it's one of those things of different informal names being applied by different areas, whether it was foreign, whether it was even scale modelers afterwards, after the war would come up with different names for German tanks, because it's easier than saying Panzerkampfwagen 6-3 something rather than calling it a Tiger.
Yeah, look, part of me is like, I don't like prescriptivism in language and on my best days, although I do like being right and proving other people wrong. So I'm kind of torn in opposite directions on that. I think given that there is pretty senior documentation at the highest levels that it was being referred to as a Hetzer by troops on the ground, and given that it has definitely been widely referred to as a Hetzer post-war, and given that anyone who is referring to a Hetzer is definitely referring to a Jagdpanzer 38, I think we're going to put Hetzer on the name of this podcast episode. So I guess we're nailing our colours to the mast. And I'm sure we'll get some comments from the YouTube audience. And by the way, I'd like to welcome the YouTube audience. We've only been putting these onto YouTube since the T55 episode.
Have we? Didn't even know that.
Yeah. It's funny because they were meant to be going on, and I was wondering why it wasn't working, but not really caring. And then for a reason I don't understand, I logged directly onto the YouTube account, which I don't normally do. And it had a little notification saying, you need to click this button if you want to have things longer than 10 minutes. It's like, well, yeah, we will never be under 10 minutes. So I tick the button and then now they just sort of shoot up automatically. So,
Yay technology.
Yay technology. I would say if you're listening on YouTube and you want to get the other episodes, then you need to go to totallytanked.libsyn.com and or just look us up on Facebook. And there's more episodes that aren't on YouTube. So
and they're really good.
They're awesome. Come along for a listen. Yeah. So anyway, I look forward to the comments from the YouTubers who have very exacting standards on these things. Cool. What more do we want to say about the Hetzer? I think we've got to at least talk about how it actually worked in service, don't we?
Yes. Mm-hmm. Look, so especially the Pak 39, Panzer Cannon Panzerwagen. No, I can't remember what the Pak stands for, but it was as I said before, it was a L48.
Yep.
7.5 or 75 millimeter cannon. It was 99% accurate out to first shot hit out to 500 meters and 71% first shot hit out to 1,000 meters. So between those two areas, which is a pretty good kill zone for it, where the penetration ability of the rounds it was firing down to take out most Allied armor at that stage, except for the heavier tanks, was pretty good. And yes, you would only be getting the one shot off and hoping you'd get the kill out and then bugging off to somewhere else, or maybe a couple of shots, depending on how much armor you're facing. So very effective in that.
I mean, the big thing was not that the Hetzer was good, but that the Hetzer was a very small package that could carry a very good gun. Which made, for that ambush role, all its other limitations didn't really matter. And you're just left with a really awesome gun. I might add, I'm just looking at what ammunition it could carry. Now, there was the high-velocity tungsten cord round, but of course, in the last days of the Third Reich, tungsten rounds were few and far between. The regular round was armor-piercing, ballistic-capped, with an explosive filler, but a tracer element.
Yes, so you can see where your round was going.
You can see where the round's going, but in terms of the visual of the battlefield, it looks like little laser beams shooting everywhere.
Well, no, the tracer was in the rear, so it was really only visible from behind.
Your side can see it.
Yeah,
but yeah, still, when
so you're seeing where your fall of shot is going.
No, I get that. I'm just talking about more the visual of the battlefield. If you would make a movie that involved these, it would look quite futuristic. People would think that's not real. It's not Star Wars. It's World War II.
All right. So you also had. They would be in a company of 4, and they'd be assigned to tank hunter battalions for an infantry division, used as a mobile anti-tank force, deployed on the flanks of positions in either a defensive or counter or built designed to be ambush or for counterattacks. So if your infantry division was in a dug-in position, you put these on the flanks of various organisations so that when the enemy allies attacked, they'd be looking for gaps between between forces, because those areas are where they're going to be weakest in personnel and communications between, because there'll be command and control will go one left or right rather than straight back into the middle. And so if you can exploit those gaps, you have a much easier time of exploiting, of breaking through the enemy and then encircling them and killing them in detail. So that's where your Hetzers get deployed, is on those edges, on those gaps, just inside any tree line was their doctrine, and that became very effective for them, because as the enemy tanks would rumble up to try and exploit those gaps between forces, they would get hit by the Hetzers and ambushed from tree line, and while they were reorganising, the Hetzers would bug out and things would keep on going from there.
Well, we say the Hetzers will bug out, but as we've mentioned, they're sort of groaning and grunting and doing a 3-point turn out of their ambush position.
Well, no, they didn't have to do a 3-point turn. They just drove backwards, because even though visibility was terrible, the commander's periscope looked backwards. That was the whole point of him being able to. His periscope, of his vision slits were faced to the rear.
His hatch actually would have given him a fair backwards view as well.
Yeah, so it was because he was at the rear of the tank. He could actually see out backwards. So when reversing out of their hidden positions, he could see where they're going. And even if it was very noisy inside this very cramped conditions, he had little buttons that he could press to, and if he couldn't be able to tell the driver to go left or right, he had little buttons which would flash up a light on the side in front of the driver to tell him left stick, right stick, or sorry, left bar, right bar, because it was a horizontal steering column rather than.
Rob's making very excellent hand gestures here.
Horizontal rather than vertical sticks.
Yeah.
So he would have to go, if a little light came up on his left, he would twist the handle to left, so to drive the tank backwards in that direction, and so forth. So there was no communication. There was no built-in comms within the tank, and only not all of them.
Well, they didn't need to, because they were sitting in each other's laps.
Well, he was still in the fog of war. You can't even hear inside there, especially if rounds are going off left, right, and centre. And your commander's facing backwards, so he's talking backwards. Not all of them had radios. Only the command tank of a company had, Hetzer of a company had a radio.
Again, for this ambush fighting, though, that just doesn't matter, because
No.
you position yourselves with a lot of shouting and hand waving, and then you sit quietly till you attack, and then you run away. So it's not like you're having to communicate to manoeuvre.
When we were talking before about the 60 mils of front armour, very sloped armour, was at a, I want to say 30 degrees, 60 degrees slope?
60 degrees slope to create an effective armour of 120 mils.
However, as we were discussing the other week of the T-34 about why the Germans didn't build them, it's because they didn't have the good enough steel. Again, with the Hetzer, the steel was very inferior. So while we say effective armour of 120 mils, it wasn't really. It was much less than that.
Yeah, one of the reasons the 38T had been retired was it was discovered that in the sub-zero temperatures of the Eastern Front, it got very brittle. And I believe they did fix that brittleness issue with the Hetzer, but certainly steel quality in general. Again, when your empire is losing, these things will get a lot harder.
Now, you'll see most Hetzers don't have a muzzle brake on the front of the tank. Now, it was actually designed with a muzzle brake, but as they started rolling them out of production, they decided, no, we're going to take that off, because they found when firing from ambush, when the round went down the barrel and the muzzle brake kicked out dirt and sand and smoke and dust and everything to the left and right, it gave away the position of the tank firing from ambush much more than if you just let the muzzle flash go straight forward. So we were discussing that before about how that would work, and John came up with the idea that if you're observing from the front and all you saw was the muzzle flash coming straight at you, you would have much less idea or much less something to look at than if you saw a great big cross of dust and flame going up and down, left and right of the muzzle brake, throwing everything out.
There is an issue with muzzle brakes that they are supposed to massively reduce recoil, which then just says to me that they figured out that the Hetzer chassis could take the full recoil of the 75mm gun. So if it can do that, then muzzle brakes start to be more trouble than they can worth. So, for example, the Tiger had to have the muzzle brake on, or it would tear the tank apart. And given that Hetzer's managed to fire without a muzzle brake, we can say that they can take it. And that mounting from the roof might have actually been part of that.
They did want to have the Pack 40s in there rather than the Pack 39s, but they didn't have enough of them and couldn't figure out a way of getting them in there effectively. So
they barely got the 75 in.
Yeah, so they did think about. So maybe it was a case of, well, if we'd had the Pack 40 in, that maybe they needed the muzzle brake for that. All right, well, we might take a break there, folks. Come back with...
Beer review.
Beer review.
Now, Rob, your old Hetzer, as it rolled off the production line 4 months after being designed, or design starting, did have a few problems aside from the fact that the gun was the wrong way around in the chassis. And I love how they just never even bothered to fix that. They weren't redesigning the Pack 39 and they weren't redesigning the chassis, and the loader was just going to have to live with that. The other problem was that with the gun on one side of the tank and forward in the tank, and yes, I'm calling it a tank, it did lean forward and to the right quite a bit.
Yeah. So how do you do that? You balance things out by putting 3 people on the left.
Yeah,
doesn't really 800 kilos of gun and ammunition on the right doesn't really.
Yeah, so that didn't fix it either. And in a sane world of quality armoured vehicle construction, you might redesign the vehicle to balance the weight on the chassis. But with this one, they just beefed up those leaf springs until it sat level. So. Thankfully, they didn't do what often happens in these situations when things are really bad, which is chuck a ton of weight on another corner of the vehicle. That has happened as well, but not here.
I mean, they over the year and a half that they were building these things, that they did figure out ways of reducing weights around the place. More holes in the idlers to lightning holes, as they call them. So that's why you'll see various Hetzers in photographs and videos with 4, 6, 8, 12 holes in the rear idler.
It is unbelievably annoying to modelers as well that there's no definitive number of holes.
And they say it can't be. Oh, you got different numbers on different sides.
Yeah,
you can't have that.
And particularly, I mean, there is a. I know there is a term that museum curators, particularly the military technology curators, have for the enthusiasts of the civilian world who annoy them, and that is rivet counters, constantly saying, "Well, your model's incorrect because it's only got 26 rivets down the left-hand side." Anyway, I imagine we've got quite a few rivet counters in our audience, and we love you.
We do.
The curators don't, but we do. Anyway, for rivet counters and modelers alike, the differences in the drive sprockets on the Hetzer are a source of continual eyebrow twitching and frustration. But fundamentally, they're all over the place. Even same models in the same unit could, over the course of a vehicle's life, end up with very different numbers of holes in that.
Because they'd swap them out between vehicles. And look,
they were all blowing up like crazy. I mean, the life expectancy of these things was not enormous.
No. Other things they did to reduce weight is they changed the way the mantler was built around the gun. Rather than having tow hooks welded onto the chassis, they said, "Oh, I'll just drop that, and then we'll drill some holes in the side of the skirts, so that you can just whack a tow cable through there." They then took those, welded some U brackets onto the side of the vehicle so that they can string some wire around these U brackets, and then you can shove your any trees or branches or grasses or anything else like that in to make it for the camouflage of the vehicle, which is very effective. Again, by being such a low profile, seeing a slight mound of grass in a sea of grass on the Russian steppes, you probably doesn't stand out nearly as much as a turret would.
Yeah, now I've got a question I've got to ask, which is, you're fighting a total war, you have limited resources, you have to make decisions about where the resources go. And there's this lean with armoured units, well, particularly units that support infantry, to try to make the package self-contained. So, like you've got with your Hetzer or your Stug, where the gun and the engine and the crew are all in one little unit, so they can't be split up, so that they're where you need them when you need them. But in terms of winning a war and using your resources most effectively, wouldn't you be better off by having a whole bunch of half-tracks, towing a whole bunch of towed anti-tank guns, and being able to use the half-tracks for other things when the anti-tank guns don't need to move around?
Yes and no. Again, your half-tracks are much more susceptible to artillery fire and aircraft attacks versus an enclosed tank.
Yeah, although the Hetzer's protection on the sides and the top was not stellar, but yeah.
No, but it's still designed to protect against artillery fragments. Is what you're looking at. Whereas open tops, half tracks, and towed artillery or anti-tank pieces are not. So
So you're saying the benefit is making it just rugged enough,
and also it provides what was it? With the Stug 3 of having the anti-tank ability, there was a winning tank at the front is part of the morale and of the doctrines. Of the German general doctrines. Basically, you have something on the front lines that's going to take out enemy tanks, because if you don't have something on the front lines that can survive on the front lines and take out enemy tanks, your infantry starts feeling very scared and starts running away and not performing as well.
Mm-hmm. And, I mean, I guess to somewhat answer my own question, with the help of that context you're just adding, we've got to remember that the Russians on the Eastern Front were deploying enormous amounts of artillery that was largely firing just at grid positions, not at anything in particular.
Yeah, taking out a grid square is a great way of suppressing the enemy.
Yeah, but even a relatively lightly armoured vehicle can be survivable in that sort of unaimed artillery, whereas anything squishy is going to get bits of shrapnel through it.
Yeah. Now, what are we drinking today, John?
One of my favourite beers ever, anywhere, and I was always looking forward to doing a Czech tank to get Czech beer. Although we had a little misfire with the Dutch beer for a Czech one. Was it Polish?
No, Poles. Yeah, I can't remember.
Okay, so this is a Budvar, which is famously from the town of Budweiser, and has been the subject of endless litigation with Anheuser-Busch and now AB InBev, the enormous Belgian brewers who make Budweiser in America, the erstwhile king of beers. But the Budvar is the original article, which was the model for when the Czech migrants arrived in the US and said, we're going to make a tasty lager. And Americans said, you know what, we like tasty lager. And obviously Budweiser is now more famous for the light beer variants, which are unsatisfying to a more hardened beer drinker. But I've loved this beer since I was 21 and drank it for the first time in Scotland. And I have always loved it any time I've seen it on tap, and I'm very glad you brought it around, Rob. I still think of the Czech lagers, Stara Pramen is probably slightly better, but frankly, unless they're both on tap, I won't be choosing between them. What do you think of this one?
It's got a lot of flavour. Look, when I went in to get it, it was the only Czech beer available to where I was getting it from. And
that is a tragedy. What kind of beer shop only has one Czech beer?
I mean... But the point being is that when I saw it was a six-pack of it was for $20, and that's basically what you're paying for a six-pack of any sort of beer these days. I thought to myself, there must be the Czech version of VB or something like that if it's importing it.
But yeah.
But it's much better than that, is my point, John, is that it's actually a quality beer rather than VB.
Yeah, now it is only a 330 milliliter bottle.
Not the 500s that we'd get in other places.
Or even the 375 that's the standard for Australian cans. But, for what is a premium lager that you can drink all night, and they're so good on a hot day as well. I think there's a scene in the Shawshank Redemption where they talk about how the happiest moment in the prison was when they were waterproofing the roof of the prison and working up in the sun, and someone had got them a case of beer, and it was a Czech beer, and how it was working in the sun while drinking Czech beer was the greatest thing you could ever do in prison. And I would believe it. Certainly, it's a miserable cold day in Canberra today.
Yes, it is.
But we're toasty and warm in the pod, and drinking Budvar, which
very tasty. And look, it sits very nicely on the tongue. It good flavour, not too fruity or anything like that. It's heavier flavour than a lot of Australian lagers. Mm-hmm. But very nice. It
warns us not to exceed 17 standard drinks in a week. So,
that's nice of them.
I don't know, 17 of these a week I could just about handle. Probably want a few more. So, if you haven't, and if you've been following us with our beer reviews in this series, this is definitely one to try. I think most Europeans would have had it before, but for the American audience, definitely get yourself some Budvar. Think of it as the original Budweiser. Then they used to say that on their labels, but they got sued, so now they don't. But I mean, have you been to the Czech Republic, Rob?
No.
Yeah, so one of the great joys of the Czech Republic is that all their bars will generally only have one beer on tap, and it'll be really good. And they're like, "This is one beer. It's really good. You don't need a choice of beers." And then you just tell them you want 3, and they get you 3. So there's no complication in the ordering, and you get a little paper docket, and they just put little dashes down and put a cross through it when you get to 5. And then when it's time to leave, you just take your thing up, and they say that's 25 beers, and that'll be an amount of money that's quite small. So yeah, I like Czech bars, I like Czech beer, I like this beer. This is good. All right, shall we get back to the Czech light tank destroyer?
Yeah, you bet. So, the end of the war wasn't the end of the Hetzer, though. So, having been overrun by the Russians in 1945, Czechoslovakia decided, well, we're going to keep on building these things because, one, for ourselves, and two, they found an export market in the Swiss. So the Swiss bought 150.
I've got to say, for Swiss doctrine, I can totally see why they went for it. It's perfect for defending little mountain passes.
Yep.
And you need a light tank that can not overstrain the bridges up in the heights. Just perfect.
So they renamed theirs the G13, so a slightly different version. So a lot of the ones you'll see on videos on YouTube will be the G13s that have been modified to look like an original Hetzer.
You paint an iron cross on it, who's going to know the difference? Exactly.
So they were in service with the Swiss Army until 1970, and that's why when they were sold off from there, they went to a lot of collectors and museums and so forth. There are a couple of other versions of the Hetzer that ran around during the war.
Can we quickly just go back to the 2 Hetzers of the Romanian army?
Yes.
Because there was a coup in
August, the August coup?
Yeah, King Michael's coup. Now, exactly what happened in all these Eastern European countries in the late stage of World War II is something that in the West we pay almost no attention to, but was an extremely big deal for the future of that part of the world as it was happening. So the Romanians changed sides basically, but they still had 2 Hetzers, which they used, and then the Red Army confiscated. So I just love the idea of the Red Army saying, no, you can't have those.
You don't get tanks. And just like the Hungarians had some, the Polish uprising, they got
captured one.
They captured one. They gave it a name, the Daredevil. It didn't have a gun on it, but they put a Panzerfaust in in the mantlet, so just ran around with that. It was more of a propaganda thing at that point because it didn't actually see combat.
I was just thinking, firing a Panzerfaust from inside your...
It would not be fun because the backblaster on that would be...
Kill the commander, I would have thought.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah.
It might have been the commander firing it from his hatch.
Yeah. Certainly, I would not like to be inside a small box that's firing a rocket.
No. So other versions of the Hetzer was they did make 50 Panzer 38s. So
Personally approved by Adolf Hitler himself.
For a light-skinned, not terribly maneuverable ambush tank,
Look,
having a flamethrower.
Not everything can be the Churchill crocodile, you know. And
having a flamethrower, I'm not sure how you was planning on using a flamethrower in an ambush tank. It's a scary. It's not really built for that doctrine.
Look, I mean, there's a reason why flamethrowers are almost completely out of use in modern militaries, although various napalm weapons have sort of taken its place. And that is just they're unbelievably dangerous to the operator. And they're really only good at reducing bunkers. I mean, that's where your flamethrower is absolutely brilliant. Someone's in a bunker, you just fire, even without the shot being hot, you just fire a bunch of petrol through the slit in the bunker, and then you count to 10, and they will run out of that bunker and throw their hands in the air.
Because even if you don't hit them with the flames or whatever, it'll just suck all the oxygen out and just kill them that way.
Yeah.
But yeah, so they built. Yeah, so I'm not sure what they were thinking with the flamethrower version, because it's not a tank designed to be advancing with your infantry and taking on bunkers. For that doesn't have the mobility, doesn't have the protection, so all you're going to be using it for is defending against infantry coming towards you, in which case you're stuffed anyway because you don't have a turret. I'm not sure how they were planning on using that.
Yeah, and flamethrowers have some capacity in an anti-infantry role, but bullets tend to work better.
Yeah.
And are less likely to explode and kill you.
Yeah. There was also the concept vehicle of the E-10, which was going to be an even lighter vehicle than the 16 tons of the Hetzer. It was only supposed to be 10 to 12, but capable of up to 70 k's an hour, with a fast-firing Pack 39 or Pack 40 inside of it. It was going to be just as low profile. So again, concept vehicle, and if you
fast firing is still a problem if the loader has to.
I think they were planning on overcoming that part.
Yeah. Right. Okay. All right.
So, which was one of the more fun tanks to zip around the battlefield in World of Tanks. I got to say, because you could get up to some stupid speeds in that thing, but the lack of turret really stuffed me because I'm not very good at driving those things. Now the vision slits on the Hetzer was very problematic. So you had
it wasn't designed to see out of though, was it? It was just designed to trundle into position
the driver
with the crosshairs on the target spot.
The driver had a vision slit to the front, and that was very limited.
Rudimentary would be a word that springs to mind. Primitive, perhaps.
Very much so. Shot trap was another one that they had to fix up.
They literally deleted from some of the models. Yeah,
I noticed. Some paintings that they painted on fake drivers.
So you get them to aim at the fake ones.
Get them to confuse the Russian anti-tank rifle snipers.
That was common even in World War I, painting fake things onto your tank to confuse the anti-tank rifles.
Mm-hmm. And so you had the driver had a vision slit, the gunner had a periscope, the commander had a periscope. I don't think
stereo periscope for the commander. It looks like Jar Jar Binks' eyes.
Well, that gives you your depth perception, be able to figure out what's the range you need to be telling your gunner to be shooting at.
Yeah.
Your loader, who has the remote control machine gun, doesn't. So he's not seeing anything. So I'm not sure how all these bits and pieces are working inside the tank.
Look, it's a metal box that trundles slowly into position, waits for the enemy to come to it, and then trundles as fast as it can away. In the meantime, not being too troubled by enemy air, which was basically what forced things like the Marder out of existence.
Now
it's. Yep, go on.
You go.
I was just going to say, part of the reason the Hetzer has taken on the sort of increasingly legendary position it has is simply because there's so many of them left. And the really interesting thing with that for me is that it comes down to the reason it was produced in the first place, which is that it's light. In tank terms, it's light. And you might not think that matters, but if someone's salvaging a battlefield and trying to find tanks to sell to collectors, The 16-ton tank can be moved away on most trucks, whereas a 40-ton tank just has to sit there and rust because you don't have a crane that can pull it off the ground. And similarly, just moving, particularly a tank that doesn't operate anymore, can be extremely hard to move around the place. And so we sort of get left with the survivor bias of the lighter tanks.
Getting dragged off by the local tractor rather than having to be disassembled and reassembled somewhere else.
Which mostly doesn't happen. They're just left to rust where they are.
All right. Now, I mentioned at the beginning that I saw this as a tank that was bad design, saved by a lot of other things going well. So you had the doctrine. So the German tank doctrine knew how to use these light tank destroyers well. They placed on the flanks of positions with good line of sight to take out enemy tanks trying to get around a position, and it's always deployed and tried to always deploy them in ambush. The number of times they tried to advance after a counterattack and not following the doctrine, they got done over very badly because they have no side armor.
And they aren't big enough to attract the attention of the heavy gear.
As soon as you come out of cover, and suddenly it's a case of, well, here's something moving slowly out of cover, and I can go straight through the sides of it. Bang, it's gone. They had proven parts, so the Pak 39 and the T38 chassis, both good enough for the job that they wanted to do. So they were able to achieve that.
Yep.
One of the things I didn't touch on before, but I'd like to now, is that there was distribution of production. Lots of different factories were building parts, so bombing one of them didn't necessarily mean slowing the production down. Like when the Stug 3 factory was bombed in Berlin, that basically slowed production right down, whereas these ones had different parts being built in different factories, mostly in Czechoslovakia, which then also provided the idea it was a lot further to go to bomb things in Czechoslovakia for the Allies than it was to bomb Berlin.
Yeah, that was a huge part of the appeal of the Czech production, was simply that the Allied bombing was pretty much completely out of range over Berlin, and the Czech facilities were just too far. It's worth noting, we look at the industrial capacity of Europe as a whole in 1939, and then you say, oh, well, the Germans have conquered all of this. So why doesn't Germany then have the industrial capacity of all the places they've conquered? And it just came down to they didn't have basically the fuel to keep those factories going in most cases. I mean, France lived as almost a medieval society through the Second World War because there was no petrol available to run any sort of vehicles. But when the Germans wanted to, and when there was a strategic advantage, then they're diverting resources to the appropriate factories. But obviously, France was a complete non-starter for that sort of thing.
Which, with those points, so I mean, once you've got your distributed production, you then rely upon your distribution, and which is your rail lines,
transport networks,
because there's no other transport sectors besides your rail for them at this stage.
Particularly for heavy things like tank parts.
Yeah. So again, if the Allied bombers are bombing factories, they're not bombing rail lines, and if they're bombing rail lines, then again there could be disruption in your production because of bombing by the Allies. But again, it was more balanced than having everything in one spot.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying, although I'd just note on that heavy bombers certainly targeted rail yards.
Yes.
And they targeted factories, but in terms of shooting up individual rail lines, that was more your tactical fighter bombers.
Yeah.
But again, they weren't flying from Allied territory to Eastern Europe, so it was whatever the Soviets were putting in the air.
Other points I'd like to say about their good design, good things going well. The time to production, because all the bits were already in use and proven, it only took 4 months from design to production, and with that, they were cheaper. That was one of the big things. They were a cheaper tank to build than a Stug 3, which is what they really probably wanted to be building, but they were cheaper and they were faster to build. So,
which is saying something, because the Stug 3 itself was saying this is going to be cheaper and faster. But it then also comes back to, you've only got so much petrol, and in the case of the Germans, it was extremely little petrol. You've got to choose what to put it into. You've only got so many crew, particularly trained, competent crew. And this is sort of why when we discussed the Tiger made no sense from an Allied point of view, but from the German point of view, investing in a better tank even if it used a bit more petrol, it still isn't using twice as much. Whereas if you put 2 Stugs in the field, the logistic footprint of those 2 Stugs is still quite high compared to a better tank. And I just question whether the Germans actually rationally figured these things out properly instead of just saying, quick. The fact that the Hetzer's factories were pretty much outside of Allied bombing range probably had as much to do with the fact it existed as anything.
I agree. There was big factors in that. But yeah, cheaper, faster to build. All these things went towards building a tank that was effective, even though the actual tank itself had a lot of things going wrong with it on the inside, especially. Yeah. But it all came together in a good little package. But tell you what, I wouldn't want to have been in one.
Yeah, I mean, no one chooses to be in an army that's losing a war. That's not great. Now, I think, I mean, to expand slightly on your point there, I'd just say that it was a very good gun, and the Hetzer itself was a mobility system that wrapped around the gun and was barely adequate, but was basically barely adequate in support of a very good weapon.
And as long as you had 4 of them and you each got 1 shot off as your 1 shot before you ran away and did something else, that was probably not a bad thing, because those 4 shots would probably do something effective.
Yeah, well, in a general advance as opposed to an assault, but in a general advance, if a vehicle blows up, it tends to set the advance back. Mm-hmm. Everyone stops and looks for where the enemy is.
You've got to redeploy. So,
yeah. So if you can keep doing that, you can certainly slow the enemy down significantly, but then you've got the question of how is this going to win the war versus just dragging it out longer.
Yeah. All right. So in 1945, when the Soviets took the Skoda factories in Czechoslovakia, there were 1,200 Hetzers in production. From the parts available, they thought there was probably enough there to build 150 tanks from what the parts were in the factory. And the rest were not enough parts delivered on site to be able to finish them off.
Well, just-in-time manufacturing. They were ahead of their time.
There you go. Mm-hmm. And look, I'd like to say shout out to the the Australian Armour and Artillery Museum in Cairns. Mm-hmm. We were talking about it the other week. I think you said it was in Townsville, and I said, no, we don't have one up there.
Look, once you get north of Brisbane, it's all the same place to me.
And I'm surprised that we actually have one, but... we do, and I'm wrong.
And why is it not at Puckapunyal?
Well, there is one at Puckapunyal, but I've never associated Cairns with anything with Australian Army or artillery. Obviously, it's there for the Chinese and Japanese tourists, because I don't know why else. But anyway, they have.
Should we ever get out of COVID restrictions, Rob? We've got to
they have
coming up. That's all I'm saying.
As of 2015, they got delivery of a working, fully restored original Hetzer. It's not a G13; it's all original parts. Mm-hmm. And when asked about why it doesn't have any Nazi markings on it, they say, "Well, that's how it came out of the factory. They didn't have time to put those markings on it before it rolled into battle." So,
wow. Okay.
So that's why if you ever get a chance to see it, John, and you see that, and you say, "Well, the reason why it doesn't have the iron crosses or anything on it is because they didn't have a time to put them on." It was restored. They were found in Czechoslovakia. It was. The engine had been decommissioned and the engine bay filled with concrete, and the gun removed. And so when they were taken across to the UK, they had to remove the concrete from the engine bay.
It'd certainly make it easier to move. Yeah, I mean, a hard day at the office.
And then source themselves the Pack 39 to install it. But they took 2 years to do that and install it into this tank, and then it's been shipped across to Australia.
Okay, all right. Well, should we ever be flying to Queensland? That's something to look forward to. Yeah. All right, we have just about hit the hour mark. That's the cat helping out. And we'd like to thank you all for listening. Particularly, we've been getting a lot of comments coming in on YouTube, mostly about the new joint French-German tank design. And I think that's something we're going to have to visit coming up soon, and we will incorporate your comments into that, folks. But in the meantime, I hope you've enjoyed this little trip through the Look, if we're going to do the universal carrier, then the Hetzer's definitely a tank. It's a fighting vehicle with tracks.
Fighting vehicle, yes, that's right.
Even the chieftain called it a tank, even though he admitted that was a mistake. On
a cold afternoon, we've enjoyed our Budvar as well.
Yes, indeed. Okay.
Thank you all.
Good night.
Bye.